presented to a panel of experts and our fellow peers. So, to start us off, for my panel members, I have the lovely Mr. Jackson, who's my college speech teacher. I have Mr. McCune, who is an IB/AP history/government teacher. I have Mr. Bailey, who is an IB history/government teacher. I have Mr. Cooney, who is just fabulous in every way. I have Mr. Nguyen, who has a degree in politics. And I have Mr. Sage.
Whoa, yeah, Mr. Sage!
Who is also wonderful in everything, but he also teaches military history/government. Okay. And I want to thank my audience members. You guys are fabulous for being here today. Now, some of you guys have flashcards that I passed out at the beginning. At some point in my presentation, I'll ask the person with a certain colored flashcard to yell out the number that's on them, and then I'll explain in context what the number means. So let's get started. The materials in this presentation are included under the fair use exemption of the U.S. copyright law, are prepared according to educational multimedia fair use guidelines, and are restricted from further use. I've always known what I wanted to do my exhibition over. It was the world I grew up in. It was the world I left behind. It was the Arab world. Now, it's been about 9 years since I left, but I still think about it every day. And I know some of you guys might be thinking, this girl's going to talk about something that's completely separate from our day-to-day life in Kansas City, Missouri. She's going to talk about a bunch of people on campus, right? But you might find that in recent years, our two worlds are more similar than not.
From New York City to Los Angeles, California, Denver, Colorado, Raleigh, North Carolina, and Spokane, Washington, Occupy Wall Street protests are spreading across the U.S.
Riot scenes play over and over like bad dreams. Over the past 2 days, these streets look like war zones.
The largest protest yet filled Liberation Square. They've seen the violence, they've seen the blood spilled, the maimed and wounded. They've seen peaceful demonstrators attacked with rocks and clubs and Molotov cocktails.
Fighting is actually a much bigger battle.
Millions of Egyptians came down to the streets in nationwide protests against President Mohamed Morsi on Sunday, the first anniversary of his term in office. This could be the largest demonstration seen in the history of the world.
In recent years, our two separate worlds have come to share one thing, and that is the spirit of rebellion. Now, in the United States, we're pretty founded on rebellion. I mean, we had the American Revolutionary War, but that was about 230 years ago. I say we still have that spirit of rebellion because our culture embodies it. From children-targeted movies like The Lion King, Pocahontas, you have Monsters, Inc., Robin Hood, Toy Story 3, to movies like the Harry Potter series, the Hunger Games series, the Star Wars franchise. We're conditioned to celebrate the group of rebels that fight against injustice. We consider the rebels overthrowing the oppressors a good thing, a happy ending. We follow the formula of the rebels, subtracting away the oppressors in a story equates to a happy ending. So we're really celebrating a successful revolution. Well, that's America. What about the Arab world? Well, let's get to that. According to a research piece by public policy professor Jack Goldstone at the George Mason University, and this was published by the Oxford University Press blog, the world has seen about 78 significant revolutions recorded in history, or more, 78 or more recorded in history. Meaning that they either tremendously shook up a country's political structure by either overthrowing a leader or just simply changing the Constitution. Now, every country had its share, I will say, or every continent had its share. I will say it's about a year old, so some countries' protests have escalated to the point that they could be considered on this list if it was updated. Now, America had one of those 78. In our area of focus, the Arab world had about 7 of the 78 or more. And I say that the Arab world has come to share that spirit of rebellion because 5 of those 7 revolutions all started together in 2011 in one form or another. They became known as the Arab Spring. Now, okay, that's fantastic. So we share a rebellious spirit. Well, let me tell you what this means to me. See, my entire family's history has been determined by the corrupt leaders of the Middle East. It all started when my parents were born and raised in a little country called Kuwait. They grew up alongside its beautiful shores and its skyline, and they got married there. But in 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and my parents had to flee the only home they ever knew. It was the first time our futures would be determined by a corrupt leader, but it wouldn't be the last. We ended up moving to another country named Lebanon, where my brothers and I were born and raised. But in 2006, a war grew out in Lebanon, and once again we found our futures in conflict. And we ended up having to move once again to the United States, where we are here today. Now, standing on the stage here with you guys today, as well as my brother sitting in the audience with you guys here today, we are living, breathing products of the conflicts that have torn the Arab world apart for decades. So when these 5 revolutions broke out, for me, for the first time in my history, my parents' history, my grandparents' history, for the first time, this war-torn region actually united for something. And that was incredible to see. Now, they founded the revolutions on the cause of wanting democracy, of wanting freedom. So my exhibition today is going to look at how well the revolutions actually achieved that call for democracy. So my essential question, which I will attempt to answer, is how has the Arab Spring affected the democratization of the Arab world? We're going to need to define some terms. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, the Arab Spring was a wave of pro-democracy protests and uprisings starting in North America and the Middle East around 2011. According to Merriam-Webster, democracy is a government in which power is vested in the people and exercised by them through a system of representation. And according to the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, the Arab world is about 22 countries in the Middle East and North Africa, so it's not just the Middle East region. So the Arab world is pretty big. There's 5 revolutions. I'm not going to talk about all 5. Instead, I chose 3 countries whose revolutions started off in the same, they had the same general oppressive dictator. They all had their revolutions, but they all met completely separate fates as a result of the revolutions. And my countries are Tunisia, Egypt, and Syria. So we're going to start off with Tunisia. Now, Tunisia was ruled by President Zine Ben Ali, and for over 2 decades he ruled Tunisia like it was a prison. According to Tunisia's country study handbook, which it's in the Library of Congress, and it was written by former U.S. Defense Intelligence analyst Harold Nelson, all 3 branches of government, the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature, are dominated by the president in Tunisia. So he can make the laws, he decides what's legal and not, and he decides how his armed forces are used. He can do whatever he wants to do in this country, and when I say anything, I mean anything. I mean, the guy changed the Constitution twice because he wanted to stay in power. He changed it once to allow himself to change it again, and then he changed it another time to keep himself elected. He also stole from the country's money reserve and used that money to fund his own bank account. So he stole people's taxes and used them for his own fund. And more than that, he banned political parties, so no one could really oppose him. The only dominant political party was his own, and he didn't let any other group have a say in parliament, which makes the laws. And according to the British Broadcasting News Company, political protest was not tolerated in Tunisia, and human rights groups accused his regime of unfairly arresting and mistreating political protesters. And in order to stop people from protesting, he taught them to fear him with the use of his police. Now, one man actually ended up challenging him. Not directly, but indirectly, and it ended up sparking the revolution in Tunisia, as well as the revolution in the entire Arab world. His name was Mohamed Bouazizi, and you can't talk about Tunisia without talking about him. So Mohamed Bouazizi worked as a street food vendor, making about $10 a day, and he served as the breadwinner in his family of 8. Now he was saving up money to send his sisters to college to get an education that he himself could not afford. But one day, a police officer confiscated his cart, and when he tried to negotiate, the officer slapped him across the face and humiliated him in public. Angry at years of humiliation, as well as losing the only possible source of income he could get, he walked over to the city hall for the According to Merriam-Webster, this is called self-immolation, which is the sacrifice of oneself for a cause. Now, in the United States, there were incidents of self-immolation that protested the Vietnam War, for example. But on a more recent note, last year, Reverend Charles Moore lit himself on fire in a parking lot to protest his own church's treatment of homosexuals, as well as to protest the still raging racism in his hometown, which used to be the KKK headquarters. Now, these two men's protests were violent unto themselves, but they tried to get their message across without being violent onto the community in itself. In the words of Martin Luther King Jr., at the center of nonviolence lies the principle of love. And these men loved the idea of equality in their hometowns, even if it seemed impossible to get so. Bouazizi dreamed of a society in which his people actually held a voice and had some dignity. But Tunisia wasn't a democracy, not even close. This is a clip of the kind of police state that the everyday students in Tunisia had to deal with.
State security agents use surveillance, arbitrary detention, and physical aggression to intimidate and persecute those whom the government deemed to be a threat.
Now, after the story of Bouazizi spread across social media, protests were hailed in his name, and Ben Ali noticed the protests growing, so he ordered his police to use as much force as necessary to quiet them down.
Following more protester deaths by both self-immolation and police brutality, the rallies and protests grew and started to spread, eventually reaching the capital, Tunis. Demonstrators were rounded up and arrested, and reports of torture were widespread. 2011 started with demonstrations as police brutality and the use of water cannons, tear gas, and live ammunition failed to quash the protests.
Now, luckily for the protesters, the military, after a few weeks, they ended up siding with them over the police.
Ben Ali's Tunisia was a police state, with the president relying on handpicked security and intelligence forces to maintain his rule. When Ben Ali ordered the Tunisian army's chief of staff, Rashid Amar, to fire on the protesters, the general refused. The military instead turned its guns on the security and intelligence forces and gangs of hooligans that Ben Ali had sent into the streets to sow panic.
Now, who has the red card?
28.
28. Now, it took 28 days of protesting to overthrow a dictator that had been ruling for about 23 years. So 28 days to get rid of a guy that had held on to his power for 23 years. That's how incredible these guys were. Now, eventually, the military's general ended up pushing Ben Ali to flee the country completely. And that concluded the revolution. Now, afterwards, and according to a foreign policy article by Ellen Meyer, who's a former West African bureau chief, the military even deployed helicopters to stop police snipers who were shooting at protesters from rooftops. And that concluded the end of the revolution. Now, a lot of stuff came up when the ban on political parties was lifted. And all the political parties started trying to get power, but then they compromised to let an independent group, which is they're not affiliated with any political left or right wing, and they drafted a new constitution. And I believe it was in January of 2011, BBC reported that Parliament passed the first new constitution since Ben Ali was ousted. Now, this constitution both limits presidential powers as well as provides civilians with basic rights which they were not given before the revolution. Now, President Ked Bij Essebsi was elected as the new president with the free elections that were held. So my essential question was, how has the Arab Spring affected the democratization of the Arab world? So for Tunisia, let's look at what happened before and after. Before, there was a police state ruled by Ben Ali. Political parties were banned. Any political opposition was stifled. And after the revolution, the ban on political parties was lifted. There were free elections. The police state was addressed as that the police didn't have as much power. And the new constitution both checked the presidential powers as well as provided civilian rights. Therefore, since the power does now lie more in the hands of the people in comparison to before, I would say that the Tunisian revolution actually advanced Tunisia's democratic status. They achieved a democratic milestone, although it is too soon to tell if they've actually become a stable democracy. So that was for Tunisia. They ended up having a successful run. And now let's move on to Egypt. Now, Egypt was ruled by President Hosni Mubarak, who for over 30 years ruled Egypt under emergency law, which, according to foreign correspondent Joshua Hamer, the law was used to jail thousands of people without charges or a warrant, as well as public gatherings of more than 5 people were declared illegal. So if you were to have this exhibition in Egypt when Hosni Mubarak was running, we would all be arrested, thrown in jail, and probably tortured just because we were in the same area together. Now, more than that, he also had restrictions on political parties, and he managed to stifle political opinion and keep people in line to stop from protesting him by also, much like Ben Ali, he used his military. According to Cairo-based journalist Ashraf Khalid in his book, Liberation Square, the emergency law kept being repeatedly renewed by the parliament, which was dominated by the president. And according to Roger Owens and Charles Tripp at the Harvard University and University of London, in Egypt, the dominant authority is the president. So he had the power to keep this kind of oppression going on for however long he wanted. So what was emergency law actually like? This is an Oscar-nominated documentary from she's a Harvard-educated Egyptian American named Jaheen Mission, and this is a documentary that she directed about Egypt's revolution.
الشرطة طول عمرهم على الشعب، ممكن يسحلوا ويعذبوا ويكهربوا وينفخوا، ولا حد يقدر يتكلم في السياسة. السياسة كانت للحزب الوطني بس.
Now, the revolutions primarily started up, the protests primarily started up when we just saw his picture at the end. His name was Khaled Saad. He was about 20-year-old, I think he was a college student, and he was resisting arrest for a crime that he supposedly did not commit, that's at least what he said. And he refused arrest, and in turn, the police beat him up, they disfigured him, and they mutilated his body. Now, after this started up, you can compare how quickly protesters started coming up with the outrage that was expressed at the deaths of Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, and Michael Brown, where social media picked up the story and started nationwide protests in their names. And the same happened for Egypt. Now, according to an Egyptian blogger who was one of the people that had a Facebook page that started the call for revolution, he was Wet and Woman, and he said that the power of the people is greater than the people in power, and that was proven both true for Ferguson as well as in Egypt. Now, it became clear that Egypt was not a democracy at the time.
كل اللي حواليا كلهم زيي. حاولوا يفرقونا بأي شكل وبأي طريقة. شعب فضل وكبر الفضل.
After the protest started up, Mubarak ordered his military to, much like Ben Ali, use as much force necessary to stop the protests, from using the same tear gas canisters that were used on the Ferguson protesters to shooting rubber bullets into the crowd indiscriminately. Eventually, the military, just like in Tunisia, they sided with the protesters over the regime.
سيد الرئيس محمد حسني مبارك تألي عن منصب رئيس الجمهورية المجلس الأعلى للقوات المسلحة بإدارة شؤون البلاد جميعا مدى جسامة هذا الأمر كل التحية والإعزاز لأرواح الشهداء.
Now, who has the blue card? 18. So 18 days of protesting to overthrow a dictator that had been ruling for over 30 years. 18 days, 30 years. That's how incredible these guys were. And I love this book so much just to show that. But after that, it became clear that the military sided with the protesters for their own sake rather than for the protesters' cause. And according to Paul Unger, his associate professor, the army seemed to be reinforcing the emergency law that was already in place when Hosni was in power. So that rather than try to overthrow the stuff that he had done to oppress these people, they made the people believe that they were going to change it, but then they never did. They ended up making it stronger. And once again, the people took to the streets, the one place that their voices actually seemed to hold power now. But this time, the military that had once stood by them became violent, more violent than Mubarak himself ever was.
The army has consistently lied to us, has killed us, has tortured us over the last 9 months, and the people out there know that. So they know what they want, and they're not leaving until they get it.
Now, in the midst of all this chaos, I'm going to talk very briefly about this because it is complicated, but I'm going to make this very brief. An Islamist political party called the Muslim Brotherhood took power. When I say took power, they first began siding with the protesters in the middle of the protest and being on their side and fighting the military. But after a while, it became clear that they were making secret deals with the military to try to get power once Hosni Mubarak was overthrown. And they ended up winning a lot of political power. And according to Samah Najib, is a professor at the American University of Cairo, the Muslim Brotherhood worked to absorb and eliminate the revolution in exchange for their own political power. Now, once again, the people once again took to the streets. This is the third time, and they did it once again. And this time, the military ended up, Muslim Brotherhood actually ended up winning the presidency after Hosni Mubarak was overthrown, and their candidate was Mohammed Morsi. Now, he was even worse than Mubarak, and he even supposedly gave himself granted himself freedom from judicial oversight, so nothing he could do could be deemed illegal. If he wanted to massacre an entire town for opposing him, no one would oppose him. Social media, the networks, cable networks were not allowed to record it. He could eliminate people and make them vanish without anyone actually holding anything against him for it. Now, the military ended up stepping in once again, and this time overthrowing him once again. And instead, now the military general, after the Sisi, ended up getting the presidential throne after Mohammed Morsi was overthrown. And I will say that, according to New York Times article, after the revolutions happened, after it was clear that the Muslim Brotherhood had bad intentions, they were declared illegal as a political party. Now, so that was a clear twist in terms of the revolutions of Egypt, and my central question was, how has the Arab Spring affected the democratization of the Arab world? So for Egypt, let's look at the before and after. Before they were ruled by emergency law, there was a ban on political parties. There were no civilian protected rights. The elections were there, but they were rigged in favor of the presiding majority party. So whatever the people actually voted, it didn't really matter. And afterwards, it is still military controlled because the head of the president himself is of military background and is using his military forces however way he wants. There was no constitution in place to check his power or check how he can use emergency law. And there are also still no guarantees for civilian rights. Therefore, I would say that the revolutions in Egypt didn't really do anything to change how the power was aligned in Egypt. power didn't lie anymore with the people at the end than it did at the beginning. Therefore, Tunisia, we said, it had a successful run. For Egypt, the revolutions didn't really affect it. It's still in the same square one it was when it started. So now we're going to move on to Syria. Now, I put a clip of Harry Potter from Syria. Harry Potter, Deathly Hallows Part 2. And I did that because Syria is fairly a little bit more complicated than the rest of them. And so this is going to might help you guys get it in perspective visually.
From this day forth, put your faith in me.
Now, I know in the actual Harry Potter Voldemort doesn't actually win. But for the past 4 years, Syria has been dealing with its own Voldemort. And, Harry Potter doesn't actually win. And Syria for the past 4 years has been dealing with its own form of Voldemort. And for the past 4 years, he has been winning. Now, his name was Bashar al-Assad. And according to the BBC News, he inherited a politically repressive and controlled political structure from his family. So this is a government that has been passed down through the generations from the same family. It's not a monarchy, but that's just how they managed to manipulate the system to keep it going through their family. And with that said, they manipulated the system to benefit their family above anyone else's. And in order to enforce their rule, just like all the other dictators, they once again did not allow for political opposition or political parties. They stifled anyone's political voice. And much like Voldemort had his Death Eaters, Bashar al-Assad had his own form of military. That was, by comparison, I guess, far more ruthless. And Voldemort is referred to as he who must not be named, right? And it became clear that Assad himself had his own kind of cryptic message beside him. And whenever someone tried to talk about a political subject, they told him that even the walls have ears, so be quiet, because you don't know who might hear you, and inform a government official, because there were spies everywhere. Now, let me tell you guys a story about this as an example. You had Ali Firza, and he was a world-renowned political cartoonist who made a hilarious joke about Middle Eastern political figures and politicians. And one day he drew a cartoon that landed him in the hospital. Now, he was walking home at night to his home one night, and a car pulled up beside him. They kidnapped him, they beat him up, they broke both of his hands to ensure he would never draw another cartoon that threatened or insulted the government ever again. And they dumped his body outside of town, on the side of the street. Freedom of speech didn't count here. Syria was not democratic, not in any sense. Now, the revolution started with the city of Dara. Here, about 15 school children were arrested and tortured and beaten because they drew anti-government graffiti on a school building, which is this school building. Now, when the parents tried to get their children back, the police told them to forget your children, and that if they really wanted more children, they could just go make some, because they're never going to see these guys ever again. Just to put things in perspective. Now, in Syria, it's not really rare for a child to go missing, or for someone to just vanish. There were plenty of bloggers that wrote politically insulting poems or passages or prose, and they were arrested and vanished, and no one ever heard from them ever again. So these kids weren't rare. But what was rare about the situation was the community's response. Protests were held in these kids' names for weeks in their city. And eventually, they couldn't keep the media out for too long. That story spread across social media to other cities, and suddenly Syria was facing a nationwide protest in the name of these children. In the words of Rosa Parks, if I can stand up for freedom, you can stand up for, or if I can sit down for freedom, you can stand up for children. And that's just what these communities did. let me give you an insight on the protests that grew out in Syria.
The Syrian president, under mounting pressure as protests spread across the country despite a series of concessions. So is revolution in Syria taking place?
In Syria, a third day of protests has been marred by violence. Police opened fire on demonstrators using tear gas and live rounds.
Witnesses say police opened fire indiscriminately, while snipers targeted individuals from nearby rooftops.
Now, with that being said, Assad, much like the other dictators, told his military to use however much necessary to stop these people, even if it meant wiping out entire villages to do so. And what's interesting about Syria that differs it from the rest of the countries is that in the midst of these protests, the protesters, the united group as a whole, started breaking apart. Now, there's a situation in Syria and it's called sectarianism. And according to free dictionary, it's the narrow-minded devotion to a single sect, which is a group that shares similar beliefs or values. So it's when you hold your own ethnic or religious group as superior to everyone else's and you refuse to associate with them because of that. And this affected Syria when you started having the united group of the protesters that were protesting what happened in Durham started breaking apart. So you suddenly had protest groups, this chunk of protesters started breaking apart. So you had this ethnic group that didn't want to be associated with the guys. They made their own rebel group. This minority group, they made their own rebel group. This other ethnic group made their own minority group, made their own rebel group. This other religious party made their own rebel group. So everyone was fighting for themselves at this point. And you can kind of look at it in regards to relating back to Harry Potter. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, the protesters started breaking apart into different chunks. And in regards, according to, I interviewed Professor Carla Klausner. She's a Middle Eastern history professor at the UMKC, and she is also a member of the Middle East Studies Association. And she told me that the different groups, the different sects in Syria could be divided up into 4 generic primary parts. And that is Assad and his supporters, the Free Syrian Army, which were the original rebels, as well as the 2 terrorist groups, which are ISIS and Al-Qaeda's branch. Now, from there, for each group, for example, for Syria's Assad's supporters, you had people like Iran and Russia helping him out from foreign support. He had Christians supporting him. He had Shia Muslims supporting him. On the other hand, the rebel army, as well as the terrorist groups, were predominantly Sunni Muslims. Once again, very briefly, to look at the differences between Shia and Muslims, they're both founded on Islam, but the 2 groups differ in their beliefs and that conflict, or their interpretation of the text. And for that, it creates a conflict for them to actually get along, so they don't really like each other. So it makes sense for each one of them to take a separate side. Now, similarly, Christians and Shia Muslims don't even really like each other. And the thing to note about this is that they also don't really like Assad for the most part. There are people that still support him, but for the most part, a lot of people don't like how he treats people. But they're still sticking with him because they like his rule better than what it would be like if any of the Sunni Muslims took over. So they're basically siding with him because they consider him the lesser of the 2 evils. And you can compare the different sects to Harry Potter. You had Voldemort, he had his Slytherin kids, he had the Snatchers, the Goblins, he had the Death Eaters, all different groups with different backgrounds. They may not even really like each other, but they joined together for one goal. They sided with Voldemort because they considered him their best bet against Harry Potter. So this is a picture of how divided the country ended up being. Each rebel group ended up taking over a separate territory. And I will point out that this makes their conflict a little bit more difficult to win on the protesters' side, because rather than having one united front, they have, it's like one rebel group has one neighborhood which can be easily overthrown, whereas 10 joined cities or neighborhoods would be much harder to take down at once. And so this division has made it harder for the protesters and rebels to actually win. This is an example of one of the neighborhoods. The military had much more advanced weapons than the rebels themselves could ever take on their own. And with that, there is significant disadvantage to the rebels' fight in Syria. In fact, many scholars have different ideas on predictions on who is going to end up actually winning the fight in Syria. And for the most part, everyone's divided on who might actually end up winning. But as it stands, there's a website dedicated to calculating the death tolls of the rebel groups in Syria. So this doesn't seem like it's going to end anytime soon. Who has green? Orange. Green. Green.
215,000.
Okay, who has the other green?
20,000.
Okay. You had 215,000 total rebels killed so far and more. The government isn't reporting a lot of the figures, about 20,000 children of the rebel groups, because they're all in general neighborhoods. Even if the children aren't affiliated with the conflict, they're considered collateral damage, if you will. And who has the orange part?
135.
Okay, there's about 100, I'm not sure. Okay, there should be about 135 people in our exhibition here today. So if you were to take our number of people and multiply it over about 1,592 auditoriums, you'd have the average death toll for Syria. And this number just keeps climbing every day. Now, there is no post-revolution for Syria because, like I said, it's still happening today. With that, my central question was, how has the Arab Spring affected the democratization of the Arab world? So for Syria, before the revolutions, political opinions were stifled. You couldn't say what you wanted. And also, political parties were banned. There was a military presence around, and the ruling party controlled everything. Well, now the power is divided between the ruling party as well as rebel groups and the terrorist groups. And they're still stifling on political opinions. So in that sense, the people now even have more targets if they want to get their freedom. And for that, I say that the Syrian revolution actually regressed or worsened their possibility of having a democratic milestone anytime soon. So we said Tunisia had a successful run. Egypt's revolution didn't really do anything for its sake. Syria's made it worse. And so 3 countries, 3 revolutions, 3 completely different fates. Why is that, though? Why is that, though? I looked at the different factors that set one country apart from the other and set one revolution apart from another. And these are the 3 factors that I found that are necessary to have a somewhat successful protest or revolution. So the first factor deals with the military's relationship with the people. Now, if you remember in Tunisia, we have the military siding with the people, and that helped quicken things a little bit. And but in Syria, the military did not side with the people, and that kind of made it worse for them to get support on a armed forces basis. And for that, number one, the one thing necessary is that you have to have the support of the armed forces at your side to have a successful revolution. But in Egypt, they did have the military support, but they still failed. And that's why I would like to add to this, they have to have the support of the military and armed forces without the military having their own corrupt intentions behind that support. Now, if you look at the civil rights movement, think about how much more quicker the protest would have been had the police not fighted the protesters, had they laid down their arms and actually supported them and joined in. The pressure on Congress to pass the civil rights bill would have been much greater if their own forces refused to participate. Now, the second factor in this, but there are reasons why the armed forces don't actually side with the protesters, and that brings me to my second factor. And that protests need to be unified by a common sense of nationalistic ground. They have to be able, the military and the protesters have to be able to relate to one another. For example, in Syria, we said the primary reason they failed is because there were so many divisions between the country that it didn't really help anyone to feel connected or to relate with one another. The military was primarily ruled by the family, and so they didn't really hold any common ground with the protesters. And the protesters didn't hold any common ground with one another either. So that kind of stopped the possibility for a unified protest. In Tunisia and Egypt, they did have different ethnic groups, but they managed to stay unified and to fight they held the common vision for the protest. They held a common goal, and that helped them stay together. And if you want to look at the civil rights movement once again in comparison, although there was the overarching nationalistic America identity, there was a division between Black America and white America. And throughout the civil rights movement, although this doesn't count for everyone, there were very many protests where white protesters and Black protesters actually sided one another. And think of the unity that combining those two different identities created. Even if the police were white or Black, they had someone in the protest that they could relate to regardless. But as history has shown us, even that's not enough sometimes to stop, to get the armed forces to stop the protesters. So that brings me to my third factor, and that there needs to be a backing from the international community. Now, in Syria, the conflict has prolonged because the international community has been divided on what exactly to do and who to actually support. Now, in contrast, when I talked to Dr. Deborah Holzer at the Southeast Missouri State University, she noted that with Egypt's revolution, President Obama made a fairly quick response to the revolution and supported the protesters. In Tunisia, world leaders supported the protesters midway through the protest to help get the pressure on the leaders to stop what they're doing. Or to the military to tell them that this is actually wrong and you need to do something. But the division in Syria on what to do with the international community's division on what to do with Syria has somewhat prolonged the conflict. Now, if you look at what happened, the other revolutions had the support of the international community across the world. If you look at the protests in Ferguson, regardless of every country's ethnic population, the majority of the countries did support our protesters. Because it became clear that if anyone actually wants to fight for anything, you're going to need the help of someone else. You're going to need the world to protest whatever injustice you're going to face in your lives. And that's why I say, you need to stand with the world as you would want them to stand with you. Thank you. For Tunisia's dictator primarily held his trust in the police, so he tried to limit the military because he was scared they would actually overpower him. So he limited their numbers, he limited the amount of weapons they had, their arsenal, and he limited so much of their power because he was scared of them overthrowing So that's why he focused more on his police. So the military wasn't as tied to the government. It was kind of pushed aside by the government in comparison to Egypt, where the government kind of and the military were kind of one.
It seemed as with all three revolutions, social media played an important factor. Could you kind of just briefly talk a little bit more about the influence of social media? Maybe would it have happened if social media hadn't been present?
Probably would not have happened. You have to remember that these dictators have massacred thousands and hundreds of thousands of people before when they tried to protest. But the fact that this set these revolutions aside was the fact that for once they were actually on camera. People could pull out their cell phones and videotape this police officer beating this guy up in the street. They could videotape this car running over someone in the street. The government couldn't hide what they were doing anymore with social media. So I will say, in Syria, something that had it started off slow to get international support because they stopped journalists from coming into the country. They didn't want major news networks to catch up on what was going, and it was based it had to be the reporters themselves that were getting fired on and shot at. They were the ones that had to record it and put it on social media for us to even know the revolution happened in Syria. Yes, Ray. See, I consider it effective in regards to raising awareness. It might not actually get the outcome that we're looking for, and it might not actually get the people that are doing these bad things in trouble, but I feel like its major point here was at least to spread the awareness of what was happening. I mean, the governments are still not held accountable. The dictators that are doing all the things that were caught on camera are still not held accountable. I believe Egypt's, he was acquitted of all charges. Everything that he did to those people, he was acquitted of the charges. So we might not get the justice in that sense, but the world got to see what was happening. Yes.
Has the U.S. military been involved in any of these revolutions?
Syria. I can't remember if they started. Are they? I don't think so. No. And that's probably for the best for the most part. To kind of let these countries work it out for themselves rather than involving even more of our soldiers to getting killed in someone else's conflict. But yeah. Yes, Jeffrey.
Do you believe that there will be another revolution in Egypt since there was no real change with the first revolution?
Because like this last elected president was Abdul Sisi, and he's been reporting to starting to do the same things that people before him, the dictators before him, have. By declaring the Muslim Brotherhood illegal, he stifled their political opinions and banned them, just like other dictators have been banning political parties. So he's been doing it at a slower pace, but it is there. When there are still reports of political protesters being arrested and beaten and tortured. So it probably will be one. Who knows when? Yes, Shannon?
Okay, so I heard about a while ago Egypt shutting down the internet. Was that due to this revolution and the social media?
Yeah. Well, there was an instance, like whenever there was a major city that was under, that were protesting, and they shut down any connections it had to the outside world to stop that information from getting out. Similarly, in Syria, like the rebel neighborhoods that they were taking over, all connections that they have to the outside world have been shut off. They can't get on the internet, they can't use phones. So these rebels are completely isolated from the rest of the world. The only reason we actually know what's happening is because we have journalists sneaking into the country or smuggling themselves into the country to catch what's happening and then bring it back to us. Yes?
Can you elaborate more on the role of terrorist organizations, especially in Syria?
Okay. Well, you have, see, I didn't focus as much on this. I didn't get a bunch of stuff on it, but I didn't really make it my focal point. But you had, at least with ISIS, you had it start off in Iraq, and it moved into Syria. saw the chaos allowed it a chance to expand itself and establish itself, having a permanent presence in Syria. So the chaos has, like the lack of stability in the country has allowed these terrorist organizations to come in and kind of claim their own territories. And the conflict between the rebels and the terrorist organizations and the government itself is having trouble keeping up with both of them. Okay.
Okay, so with how complex the Syrian situation is, what do you think the best action would be for the international community to take for Syria?
There was talk about a coalition being formed to perform airstrikes on Syria, at least to drive out the terrorist organizations. And whenever there were sanctions to be made against Syria, you had its supporters, Russia and Iran, and they stopped any sanctions to help out and to stop Assad's regime. So world leaders are kind of facing a struggle when it comes to actually how they should work, and I'm probably not the best person to ask this, because I myself have no idea how they would go about this. But I have seen the power that individual citizens have been able to